Hey, welcome to Dirk Island. This is the weekend show where we watch interesting documentaries and talk about them.
Okay, so RBG, notorious RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I really enjoyed this.
I ask no favor for my sex. All I ask of our brethren is that they take their feet off our necks.
Hearing about some of the cases, obviously I went to law school, had to research a lot of stuff. I also followed the Supreme Court, and she is also just a huge figure. I see her as a battler for a side, and probably the greatest one, that I've either read cases of or seen on the left of, the liberal side of the aisle in the Supreme Court. I don't know, respect her at that level the same way that when I was reading opinions by Scalia in law school, being like, Jesus, even if I don't agree with this guy, he is an incredible person as far as a justice and arguing for something. Just a force to be reckoned with. Like, you're seeing a person in an army who's like just a ridiculously fierce, or on a sports team is maybe a better way, but like someone's like, even if they're on the fucking wrong side of whatever, they are incredible. And I think she is like one of those, and so was he. And there are a number of them. I mean, they're all incredible lawyers to be on the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I came at it from a less educated on her perspective than you, I'm sure, in the law, and I really enjoyed it. I think it's just so much respect for someone who has gained so much ground for the rights of women, seemed to be her focus throughout her career and was kind of a theme of the movie, and just someone who we see a lot of activism in the streets, lodging complaints are making an issue known, and it's interesting to see this more quiet, super smart person who's just gained so much ground in this very focused and pragmatic and concrete way. She's just won victories. She doesn't do it by being big or splashy in the press, even though she has been in the press and is well known, but just kind of, I love this idea of someone who uses the law to really make progress, because it's so contrasting to what you kind of see in the public sphere and news of just how activists work and how making a rouse about something works, versus someone who's almost the contrary of that. They aren't really loud and they're not using the press. In fact, they're supposed to remain out of that and unbiased, and just slowly, but every victory she makes is totally concrete, at least in the beginning of her career. And then it was interesting to see also about her dissenting, the dissenter that she was when she wasn't necessarily making progress, but loses, or the court goes against her, and she makes these super articulate and kind of, for a whole segment of the country, holds, gives us kind of a true north of why she disagrees.
I mean, just like the
cool.
one as a good example of that, the one thing she said in the Voting Rights Act repeal case, where the Voting Rights Act had been there to stop any sort of voter discrimination or repression for so long, because it actually existed, obviously, in like a lot of places in the South where they had discrimination in voting. And so they put this in, and then, it gets repealed, and they're basically, the majority, the conservative majority is like, well, times have changed. Like, we don't have voting discrimination, so we don't need this law anymore. And she just says it perfectly. Like, this is like saying, you have an umbrella on top of you in a rainstorm and going, I'm not getting wet, so I guess I don't need this umbrella anymore. And it's so perfect, as far as that's a battler. That's what Scalia could do for the conservatives. He could just make the other side feel because that makes you feel like you're so right? She must be so right. And he could do that for the other side. But yeah, it's interesting because they were both friends too. That's like a interesting dynamic that's a little bit discussed in this as well. Two people extremely ideologically opposed to each other just on the court, but like both liked opera, both just like kind of quirky individuals, probably both just complete workaholics. I think that came through pretty hard in this documentary. It's a whole other tangent, but when I see this documentary and I see how she acts, I mean, I don't. You see it with lawyers a lot, but it's this, you see someone who works so much and the work isn't like, I know people are busy. People are extremely busy in all sorts of businesses around the world, but there are some people who the way they do work, it does resemble, to me at least, more of an escape of reality, just like other, aholic type things, like, or addict type things look like. So, workaholic to me is like such a real thing. It's not like oh, you're a workaholic, like whatever. Like, that's not like it, I don't see it as fun. I see it as like, oh my god, like she's
You've
clearly a
seen it.
workaholic. Like, and
Yeah.
and I think people are like okay with having her be a workaholic, like. And that's just my opinion of it, but like they just describe it in so many ways. Like, her husband's trying to get her to come home at night and remind her to eat at least once a day, and like I don't even know, just the craziest things. And then just always just diving, and just the idea that she's always staying up all night every night. And I think there's a certain level where it's like, oh my god, that's so great for the for the cause or whatever. Like, she's just a fucking soldier who works harder than everyone else and is just like the best. But I don't know. I see it as like an addiction.
Yeah.
An addiction. And it's not only, yes, it's great to have like a cause and to work really hard and have successes. I mean, she's been one of the most successful people there is, but it's, I think that's what this portrait is from a more of a, I totally respect her, and I think she's done so many great things in her career, and still is, even though I wish she would have retired a few years ago, so that, you know, we don't have the situation we have now where we're really relying on the fact that when she works out in the morning, like, that's like real, and it's not done to like make people think that she's like still really at it and with it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I worry about her getting replaced involuntarily, But anyway, aside from all that, I think that the portrait that's painted is of a person who is so incredibly addicted to the work, and I mean that's just the way I see it. I just see it as an addiction, and I get that people can be like addicted to great things. What?
Maybe you get that a little from being in the law profession. I've gone to law school. You just know what that means for her to be living that life. I mean, I got it a little bit with her husband talk. I just didn't latch onto it as much, but I imagine it's because you understand what it takes to even be
You
in
can
that
see,
sphere.
I mean, I just see certain things in people, and maybe it is because of that, or maybe it's just because of just the way that I see all things. I think that sometimes people work, and they're not always just doing it to accomplish the task that is apparently in front of them, but it is to continually reinforce a narrative inside of one's mind that I am progressing, I am accomplishing, I am doing more. And in law in particular is a very addicting prestige-related industry where people are constantly, usually people who become lawyers are people who have done very well in traditional academics, and then once they get into law school, then it all really starts. Like, the competition among all these people who have already done really well is now everyone's like, oh, I should be again in like the top percent, and I should then again get all these things and get this prestige and go to this and it's just a constant ratcheting of prestige related achievements. And I think it does reinforce a lot of things that, I mean, just to put some context on it, I was just reading day or two ago about a guy who at a big law firm in Los Angeles who committed suicide, big bankruptcy lawyer, and he committed suicide, and it's just alarming to me. I just like this idea that he said things to his wife. His wife wrote an op-ed about this, and he becomes a partner at a big law firm. It's like it's like really a hard thing to do in life. I mean, there are not that many of them. They work their ass off. It's not being on the Supreme Court, not even close, but it's like a really hard thing to do. And these people who do it, sometimes you can see that some people perhaps have a bit of an addiction to, it's just the next step of a constant addiction of prestige and the next thing. And certainly not everyone is like that. I mean, maybe even the majority are not necessarily like that who are lawyers, but some people, cannot control their own mental impulse, and you wonder sometimes why are they working so much, and it's not always just such a clear answer like, oh, that's just because they like are so much more devoted than you. You know, it's like sometimes it's like, oh no, actually, like, because like they couldn't just like sit on a couch and like she didn't watch TV. That was the thing. Like I just don't. I guess I'm just like not a, you know, some people are just better than me, I guess. She's just way better than me, you know? She doesn't watch TV. She, you know, fucking just has done like 6 of the greatest like Supreme Court victory, you know, like all these great victories. You know, it's one of those things, a portrait of a person who's so much better than you. And truthfully, I'm not even being sarcastic about this, just done so much more with their life that it's hard to even imagine how someone does so much. And yet,
Yeah.
I mean, especially with the adversity she's gone through, which is why this is so interesting to watch. I mean, looking at her like Harvard Law School class photo.
She's like the only woman.
Yeah, and just being the only one, and then also being invited. It's like in one class, but then you know gets invited to the dean's office, and just describing like 8 women get invited, or however many there were in a class of 500, and being described, and like, you know, the dean or something at the time goes, you know, so what do you women feel about taking the spot of like 8 men who could be in your place? Just like, and she's like all the slights. Could you imagine having something said to you like that? It would just be so great. And then so it makes all of her victories so creative and interesting. Like the one where, you know, she has a traditional case about like women should have the same right to do something if they're equal and qualified. But the reverse of that, when they're creatively like, you know, bolstering the law by getting a guy to be like, I should be able to get maternity, you know, like Social Security related to like my status as a home caregiver for a child. Like it shouldn't be excluded just to women. It's a very creative case to take and to win, you know, or to go.
I loved that about her, and I like there's something so, I mean, those old school civil rights people where by necessity, but it's also so cool that they really stick to the principle of equality, which I think is so great that she would have I mean, and it's so smart and strategic too of her to go, okay, I'm not just about pro women, I'm about gender equality, and taking on the case of a guy who couldn't get the rights of a woman. It's really smart, and it's like she also wins it and she changes the law for people. I like love that. And so in so many ways she's like everything you want for progress. Like she's not obnoxious, she's not over the top, she's not biased in any way. She's not biased, she's principled, you know. She's not taking a side. She's having morality. Like there's something so like old school and disciplined and awesome about the way she's made progress, I think, that just dispels any sort of, I think you could say, what you could launch against her, which is she's biased, she's an activist, she's not, you know, principled, and she's clearly just all of those things, which I kind of love, because she in no way embodies like what you could attack like a modern day activist for being, like, you know. I don't say that in a negative way. I say it in a way that's like really awesome to see. Oh, she's been doing this for, just because I'm learning about her now, she's been doing this for decades.
And I think that's part of the point of the documentary. Like a lot of people are just learning about her now, like going, oh shit, she's important, and like we hope she like doesn't have to retire.
Her career pre-Supreme Court was characterized by going and presenting. It said she won 5 out of 6 cases she took to the Supreme Court when she was an attorney, which sounds amazing, like this great career. And then during the Bush years, who I forget who exactly was appointed, like 2 justices, I believe.
Yeah, so like and Bush v. Gore goes the way that Bush basically gets the presidency, and the recounts stop, and nothing else is done, and
it's a little depressing.
And after that, you know, and after that little thing, 600 votes, that where there was a lot of problems in Florida, putting the, you know, electoral college one way, and then, you know, all of a sudden the Supreme Court has gone in a direction since then, and the direction is George Bush got 2 appointments, and so we have a completely different look of the Supreme Court than we might have had if history had been just ever so slightly different. And I also think that's one of the things that's so important about the Supreme Court, and it's tough for me just as a voter looking around. I mean, I know what the Supreme Court is and does, and it's very difficult to not care so much about your vote in the context of the Supreme Court, because that is really the only thing that the president, like, for sure does, and like
that
so
affects you so much. And
yeah, people don't even see how much it affects you, but it's so. I mean, if you were to not have a good, like, that much knowledge about the Supreme Court, like, this document would be great for someone like that, just because you see how important it is to our society and to what you believe is America, and it's obviously RBG, and maybe if you're a conservative you would think the other thing, but there are things that have been done for conservatives. You could have this type of documentary for another person, you would still understand the Supreme Court is very important. And one of the most important things that you do when you vote for president in the United States is vote for the person who appoints the Supreme Court justices, because the Supreme Court justices often are the people who actually, like,
are you trying to teach the people?
What? What?
No, I was saying, are you trying to teach the people, for who voted a certain way in the last election? And
Well, I just think it's
just by the way,
yeah, it's completely
in
foreseeable.
case you were going to make this issue your voting issue, Supreme Court justices.
No,
like,
or you're going to say, like,
pro-choice.
what difference does my vote make? What difference does my vote make? Well, I mean, the only difference is that, like, men and women, what do you think about equal protection between men and women? What do you think about a lot of things that the Supreme Court has? What do you think about segregation in schools? Like, what do you think about all that? You think that's just, like, something that you think the court just exists on its own? No, it's all appointed by the president of the United States.
Shouldn't technically both parties be in favor of both of those things?
Well, exactly, yeah, of course, because that's what the law is now, and everyone takes credit for everything good that's ever happened. But obviously, there was always dissenters on. Oh, at least a lot of these opinions had dissenters, and overcoming political forces, and it's just a very important branch, and everything looks so easy in retrospect. But yeah, when we don't know what the impact yet of the 2016 election is, for example, because we don't know the 20-year Supreme Court history that we're going to live with now. We've lived a little bit with the 20-year history of the Supreme Court since George W. Bush and Bush v. Gore. I mean, it's now, almost, we're 2019, so we're sitting here and we're like, almost 20 years later. That's a long time. A lot of these people who have been appointed, Alito, Justice Roberts, we've seen certain things, and it's both ways, but we saw Obamacare get upheld, but we saw Voting Rights Act go. Mm-hmm. We saw the we saw gay marriage get upheld, or basically the prohibitions against it get put away, so that gay marriage is the law of the land now. But we've also seen Citizens United, so that there's much more. There's been a lot of victories on both sides, essentially, and the law does change significantly what we think about America. For all of these very important issues is very much the president, who the people elect or decide not to vote, or decide to vote on other issues. The president appoints these people who make very significant contributions to what we all believe and live in America, as much as any, I feel like, law is, because interpreting the law and whether or not something does withstand scrutiny under the Constitution and it's just so important. And so it's just a reminder of that, a reminder of how important the Supreme Court is and how important certain people are on the Supreme Court, and therefore how important voting for president is, because they're the people who put these people on. And it's not, and although, the Brett Kavanaugh thing was just a complete, just mess, fiasco, craziness, but
I know.
But it's like,
I'm sure you have, like, both sides. Some would be like, I know, it was so ridiculous what they did to him.
Yeah, the whole thing was a mess.
You
Whatever
did
side
not mean it that way.
That's the only thing. Yeah, exactly right.
Sorry,
but yeah, it's a mess. But you just sit there and you're like, I just wish more people knew about the Supreme Court, because the time to complain about the justices is before you vote for president, is really the truth of the matter. Because unless we want to ruin the whole appointment system and just take away the power of the president and just have the Senate vote for Supreme Court justices, and then you got to get the Senate, and then you get Supreme Court. But I mean, realistically, at least used to kind of be like the president appoints it, and the Senate really just they consent, and it goes through, and we'll see if that's how it continues, because people have gotten so contentious on it. But I've always thought of one of the main things you're doing when you're voting for president is actually voting for who they might appoint.
Is it legitimate to contest them, you think? I mean, is that
What?
a legitimate part of the process, is contesting these justices? Or are we really supposed to, without anything major, vote them through? When I say we, the Senate, is supposed to just vote them through?
No, I think that you should contest the judges and you should vet them. And I think that it's completely legitimate to make sure that people are actually qualified. So it's not just a political operative who's like super young, who's going to be on this court for a gazillion years and like doesn't actually have valid experience. I mean, I'm a lawyer, but should I be the Supreme Court justice right now? Definitely not. I mean, there's just like, so I think a person with similar amount of experience could hypothetically be, and there was one that Trump tried to put on who like couldn't answer basic questions, and I could answer those questions. I'm not like
Really?
Actually, there's someone who couldn't answer basic questions about like what it was just kind
About
of
the law.
Yeah, not to the Supreme Court, but to a lower level court. But still, you're just like...
It was like, you should not hold this position.
Yeah, so there is a very important role in vetting the judges to make sure they're actually qualified to do the job.
So this was a political operative, basically?
I don't know. It was just some young person without that much experience who had like agency experience, had a law degree and like experience at some agency, and I don't know. Anyway, it's just like, so you do need to vet them. Like, it's important that you can actually fulfill the job of a judge, and there are plenty of shit judges out there, so there's plenty of vetting that doesn't even work. But the reality is you do need to vet people, and you do need to make sure they have the character. I mean, one of the most important things of a judge is integrity, real integrity, not corruptible. I mean, if we had judges who would possibly even take a bribe or any sort of moral corruption in their past or present or bribeability,
like,
or
what a threat.
Yeah, I mean that would be the worst. So we need absolute belief as a country that these judges are actually morally, like, they will not cross certain lines. And so that is also a huge component.
Lie under oath.
Yeah, exactly. Some of these we're losing, right? Some of these freaking like should be a thing they would never do. We're losing trust.
Lie.
Who would not tell you that the Devil's Triangle is a quarters game? You wouldn't know. You don't play quarters. But anyway, it's like so that kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, it's really important, I think, that people believe that these judges are honest, even if they are adamantly against your position. And then I do believe there are things to vet for, and I do believe that vetting doesn't always happen effectively. But I do also think that it is a power that is kind of vested in the president, and that is that's one of the ways that the system works, is that the president is really the one who nominates people for the Supreme Court. And when you're a voter, that you're voting for the president, but you're also voting for a representative to then go hire people for you. Hire the person who's going to head the EPA, hire the person who's going to head the Department of Defense, or the Secretary of State who's going to negotiate stuff, or the person who's going to go to the UN. You're hiring, you're voting for someone who's then going to go hire those people, and they're going to hire the Supreme Court justices. And the Supreme Court justices are the most important and the most lasting of those positions that I'm listing. And that's what a voter is doing when they're voting for president. And I know that not all people really are fully thinking that through, because the Supreme Court justices last way longer than the presidents do. And so,
if you, I have a question. Let's say you wanted to get rid of the Second Amendment, for example. Is that something, since it's the Supreme Court's job to basically interpret the Constitution, how would you go? Is it a completely different process if you're like, we straight up want rid of the Second Amendment?
Yeah,
how do they do the amendments that totally like?
You have to repeal the amendment, which has been done before. You know, we had prohibition that was passed by an amendment to the Constitution, and then repealing prohibition was an amendment to repeal that prior amendment. So you have to do.
Is that Supreme Court related at all?
No,
process?
it's actually no. The Supreme Court is not involved, to my knowledge, at all, and it's basically you have to get it passed, I believe, in both houses. Plus, you have to get, and it's a huge majority. You have to get like a 2/3 majority of all the states to agree to it. Also, it's very hard to have an amendment.
But has happened in terms of
has happened.
Twice.
I don't know. I feel like I should know more of this shit. I haven't done constitutional law, but we have a lot of amendments.
Yeah, we do.
We have much more.
We have
much more than 14. We have much more than 14, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the real important ones are the first 10, right? The Bill of Rights. And then the 14th Amendment, equal protection. 13th Amendment, obviously, like abolishing slavery. And we've had, term limits for presidents. The right to vote for women, I think, is an amendment to the Constitution, which is crazy because you should have been able to do it with the 14th Amendment, but people were using the 14th Amendment that way at the time.
So weird.
But I probably need to edit that out if it's not true. But
you said it
no,
could be.
I know.
You put the disclaimer out there already.
Yeah, I'm like, oh God, I should know this better. No, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I found myself being a big fan of RBG by the end of the documentary, but I would like to also believe I could look at that I would like to believe the Supreme Court is an institution where I could have equal respect for the conservative judges. Even though it seems like with some of the conclusions they've come to, I don't quite understand.
Yeah.
Like that, what's the big one that allowed money into, it was about
Citizens United.
Yeah, that was a confusing one for me. I didn't understand how that happened.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that other people think that way about the Second Amendment, that, basically there was a more recent decision called Heller where people just, the Second Amendment's worded very weird, like, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the, to a free state, the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. It's a very, all this stuff is written in this kind of strange roundabout way, and so it actually does require people to be like, what do they mean? Like, only a militia gets a gun? Like, and some people have tried to come up and be like, that's the argument. Like, only a militia being necessary for the free state gets a gun. Like, so no hunting, no handguns, no what, that's like, then you got all those conflicts, right? Where you're like, wait, so like, if you're trying to defend your country as like part of a militia for a free state, like, you need the most ridiculous guns possible. Like, how are you going to stop me from having an automatic weapon if I'm going to try to be defending the free state as part of a militia? Like, but we do prevent people from having automatic weapons, but like we don't prevent them from hunting. So anyway, they
do seem.
It's this, yeah. So you really have to interpret the
the
Constitution, even though people like to what?
Well, when I hear that in order to form a militia that can, whatever the way the Second Amendment reads, what is it? It's in order to form a militia,
or it's a well-regulated militia being necessary for a free state. I'm gonna mispronounce some of the words, but being necessary for a free state, the right to keep and bear arms should not be infringed.
Yeah, which does seem to be more basically an advocacy of. It would make it seem like any restrictions on something you'd need to fight in a militia would be unconstitutional.
To fight an invading army.
Yeah, which basically means couldn't limit extended clips, can't limit assault rifles. I mean, that's the read that seems to make sense.
Yeah,
it's not what I necessarily agree with.
Exactly.
But like, how is there another interpretation that makes sense to you?
Well, I mean, I think that the problem with that interpretation so harshly is that it's hard to understand why hunting should be a thing. Like why you should be able to have guns for hunting. Or why you should be able to have like random little pistols to like.
But isn't that not how rights? Isn't that not how rights work? Aren't they supposed to? If you're afforded a right in one category, you're supposed to be as broad broad and least infringing on the American people's rights as absolutely necessary. So if you can have it under the provision of being a part of a militia, you would be able to have it for hunting as well. You wouldn't just get to unnecessarily. You're not supposed to say, oh, well, it says in a militia, so we're going to narrow this right down to as small as we can make it. Aren't you supposed to, within reason, not cut down the rights as much as possible? And if any citizen is potentially supposed to be in this militia, any citizen can have the guns necessary to be a part of that militia.
Usually the way it comes up, like with, I believe the case was about gun-free zones. Oh, God, I don't remember this so well because it's not the most interesting area of law to me, because I think the Second Amendment is very complicated and hard, really, because I do think that people shouldn't have automatic weapons, even though that is illegal, so I just agree with the law. But I also, I'm not sure that I necessarily agree with where they came out in Heller, which is basically this whole militia thing doesn't really matter. You can't have a gun. I think it was about a gun-free zone, or in DC it was some law about where you could have guns or not. And so what happens is a state, or a city passes a law, or even the Congress passes a law, and then someone sues and says your law is unconstitutional, it violates the Second Amendment. So then you have to decide whether or not what they have tried to restrict is conflicting with the scope of the right that the Constitution grants you. And then they're going to say, well, this is not part of a well-regulated militia. So then you have to have the discussion. And so Scalia, in one of his last big punches in the gut to a lot of people who oppose him, wrote this decision that's going to stand probably for a long time about how to interpret the Second Amendment and close that door completely on the well-regulated militia as an actual thing. And even if we're going back to the original interpretation, we're talking about stopping the British government from coming in. That's the thing. We want to have people who can defend themselves from the government, from tyranny. And that's it. It's not all the other stuff.
Yeah.
And so now it's really just our modern understanding of what the Second Amendment is. People can have guns within reason, without silencers, without automatic, but for the most part, they can have guns, they can have pistols, they can have hunting guns, they can have AR.
I'm not sure it makes sense to me. I mean, when I read it, I don't see another reasonable interpretation.
You mean as opposed to just any gun should be allowed?
Yeah, I mean, when I read the words of the Second Amendment, it just seems like you should be allowed to have a automatic rifle.
And I think a lot of people who really like the Second Amendment agree completely, and then I think even a lot of people who would rather the right to bear arms. And I also would be
fine to get rid of it.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of people so Brett Stevens from the New York Times wrote an article saying repeal the Second Amendment, which is basically, it's kind of like we were talking about when we were talking about the documentary Eating Animals, where, and this is obviously a far tangent from RBG, but where you're talking about what's an ideologically pure position to take. And that's one of the things he said basically is if you really don't like guns, it's not so, there's a lot of internal inconsistencies with arguing a bunch of ways. The actually cleanest, most pure thing would just be to come out with it and say, I'd like to repeal the Second Amendment. Either do a new amendment saying people can have very limited guns, no automatic weapons, no AR style gun, whatever they want to say. They can have guns for hunting under permits. They can have guns, but they have to get a licensing system like a car driver's license where you have multiple tests, both written and whatever they want to say, whatever people want to do. But just you got to start from scratch because the Second Amendment is pretty broad just on its words. And if you're interpreting the Constitution and trying to go pretty broad with it, or trying to go pretty broad's not the right term because broad could go everywhere, but trying to do it this more original intent type of way of interpreting the Constitution, is a very conservative way of looking at the Constitution, which oftentimes people criticize the rights of people in the United States didn't include all people at the time that the Constitution was written. So what are you talking about original intent? More than half the people didn't have rights at all. So that's not a non-starter. But a lot of people still are okay, original intent is the actual way. And if you want to change it, like there is a process. It's called like repeal an amendment, add a new one, whatever. Also, though, I feel like repealing one of the first 10 amendments would be like, I mean, that's like, this is the Bill of Rights. Like, you're going to repeal one of the first 10?
First two.
The first one, no, you're going to repeal the second one.
Second.
I mean, it is not as good as the first one. The first one is definitely the greatest amendment, but yeah, at least if that's what most Americans believe.
When
Most
the first
Americans
one
believe
fails,
is
the second one will still prevail.
I have not heard that. Is that a real slogan?
No.
Oh, God. When the first one fails, the second will still prevail. It's like, I don't even, that's like strangely dark. I'm not even sure how to understand it, but yes, I hope we don't have to wait for the first one to fail so the second can still prevail. God, that doesn't sound like a good time in America.
Yeah, it sounds like the Second Amendment will really have to become important.
The Second Amendment is a good backstop to protect the First. It's like, don't you fuck with the First Amendment. Like, we got the Second Amendment right behind it to fuck with you if you ever succeed. No. That's not necessarily the type of it's just a funny thought. That's not necessarily what I think at all, actually. But
I say lots of things I don't actually think.
Yeah, no, that is a funny way of thinking about stuff. But anyway, this documentary, obviously, just so many great things about thinking a little more about the Supreme Court, and also like how I haven't watched that many about this kind of stuff. I haven't actually watched the documentary made on the case against State, but I did follow that case, so I probably know most of what's in it. But yeah, it's like that's the gay marriage case. But yeah, it's like I mean, just really good, and also just a profile of a person who does have such a rich career to look back on.
Yeah, lots of respect for what she's definitely worth an hour and a half of your time.
So much.
Yeah, I felt like I should have already read a lot more about her. Super impressive.
Yeah, and if you don't like Ruth Bader Ginsburg or anything, I mean, I would totally watch one of these if well made on an opposing side. And I think that someone who doesn't like her would still probably like this, or at least be interested in it, because it does show what a legal titan is like, a little bit full spectrum. And there are legal titans on both sides of the aisle, or both political sides of the spectrum, and they're, just understanding what that is kind of interesting to look at. Anything else on this?
No, I liked it.
Yeah, me too. Okay. Thanks very much for watching us. Please subscribe on YouTube if you want to keep up and learn about more documentaries that we're watching. And also, you can subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts if you want to listen to the audio version. Thanks very much.
Thanks.